I used this comic to put together a pitch, like, okay, I want to do more of these. I want to do a whole collection of 10. And you can see that telling stories in this way is a little bit controversial. Not everyone is on board with nonfiction comics. When people hear the word comic, especially people that don't read a lot of comics, they often think it's going to be funny. They think it's going to be satire, or that you're going to be making fun of the people who are in it. And I really wanted to say, okay, no, there's actually a whole genre of nonfiction, comics journalism style narratives that are telling really serious stories in a really emotionally evocative and compelling way using comics. So they're not funny. They're more serious and really using that visual medium to tell an important story. So when Trump was elected, finally, it felt like there was more public interest in Guantanamo. Suddenly, it seems like Americans remembered that Guantanamo existed. And instead of shutting down the prison, there were plans to expand it. And so I was able to pitch this book. And it was picked up by Abrams Comics Arts. Over the next year, I spent a long time interviewing and then transcribing those interviews. This is me and my cat as we listened to like hours and hours and hours of interview tape and transcribe it. So I took those interviews and I turned them into scripts for the comic. And then I actually got to go visit Guantanamo. To go to Guantanamo on a media tour, which happened maybe once a year, you have to apply to the military. They do a background check. And if they decide that you're a member of like legitimate media in their terms, you can go, but you pay your own way. And it costs about $2,000. So I actually got to go visit the base and do a kind of a PR style tour of the prison. This was really important for being able to make a comic about it. I very quickly started taking photos of everything. This is my ticket to go there, because I knew that I was going to be passing all this stuff along to comics artists, and they want to get all these details right. So here's the ferry that you take to get to Guantanamo. The whole time I'm thinking about, okay, how am I going to represent this on the page? What kind of visual information are the artists going to need in order to draw this place and make it feel real to people? We saw that photo from 2002 of the men who were in prison kneeling with the goggles and the headphones on in the orange jumpsuits. That's at Camp X-Ray. This is what Camp X-Ray looks like today. It's really overgrown, it's run down, and it's slated to be demolished. And to me, that really felt like a really important place to be and to witness. It felt to me like being on dark ground where something terrible had happened, and we don't incorporate it into our history as Americans. We're just gonna let it get overgrown, and then we're gonna burn it down. So I kept thinking about, wow, what would it look like if we turn this place into some kind of memorial? If we treated this the way that other countries have treated crimes in their history, or even in the occasional times that Americans have been able to recognize the horrors of our own past and memorialize those in some way, what would that look like? And instead, I think that this will probably be demolished within the next few years, and that kind of history will be lost. Here's a couple other photos I took as reference. This was a media tour, so as you can see, it was a bunch of reporters coming down on a plane, and a whole group of people. This is actually a group from the Alabama National Guard that was there to escort us around the whole time and make sure we didn't wander away. So when taking photos for comics, I'm always looking for those details. So I want to get all the details of the uniforms right. I want to make sure that all the patches and the name tags, those kind of details really make a comic feel real. Other stuff that I took around base was just photos of here's what life is like on the Guantanamo Bay base. This is a sign marking a hiking trail there for other people that live there. There's lots of hiking and running. As I said, there's a McDonald's there. So this is what the McDonald's looks like. And I knew that these were elements that were going to be incorporated into the book to make it feel like, okay, this is what life is like there. This is a photo from in the dining hall. I thought these types of coffees were really funny. I was like, wow, this really takes it to the extreme. One is called Jamaican Me Crazy, and one is called Valor Blend, the most patriotic coffee. And then when I was there, it was weirdly, very weirdly, an escape room happening at Guantanamo Bay. The library on base, the morale and wellness group had organized an escape room during the time that I was there. And I was like, wow, you could not make this stuff up. This is what the actual prison looks like. As I said, we're not allowed to actually talk to or interact with prisoners in any way. So they give us a tour of like an empty wing of the prison, and you can take photos there. This is, like it says at the top, a library, so there's a collection of books there. Because we're not allowed to talk to any prisoners, I wanted to like try and see whatever signs of like humanity I could find to incorporate into the comic. So what books are they reading? What are they interested in? Those kinds of details, just as much as possible, trying to bring out who those people are and what they're thinking about and what they feel. At the prison, there's, or like on the base, there's a gift shop. Pretty much every military base has like an exchange where you can buy souvenirs and stuff, and Guantanamo's is no different. While around the world, you know, Guantanamo is seen as like a massive human rights abuse, there it's just like another military base. So we have a lot of like Disney branded merchandise. The word that people use to describe Guantanamo is always surreal, and it definitely felt that way. There's a Minions branded Guantanamo Bay t-shirt. And I decided to base the cover of the book around this postcard that I bought there. These are published by Lantern Press. This is a postcard that sold at Guantanamo Bay, and it really felt to me like this is the vision of Guantanamo that the United States government is trying to sell. It's beautiful, there's beaches, everything is safe, humane, and legal here. So I use that as the basis for the cover of the book, which is illustrated by the artist Maria Nguyen. And I wanted to take this kind of sunset image and then juxtapose it with some scenes of real life horror from the prison, so that when you see this beautiful sunset, it looks nice, but then when you look a little closer, it's actually really grotesque and unsettling and violent. And that's what I'm hoping people will do with all of Guantanamo is, you know, look at the image that the government is selling and then look a little closer to see what's really going on. I want to show you a little bit about how the book was made. So this is a script for the first chapter of the book. And then I'm going to show you the work in progress pages leading up to the final draft. People always ask about how comics are made, so just walk you through that. So this is, as you can see, I write out the script, all the text of the book, including images for each panel and then text for each panel. And for the images, we do what's called visual fact checking. So I shared the pencil drafts of the book with each person who I interviewed and asked them to correct anything that was incorrect. So like, is your uniform correct? Is the way that this person is handcuffed, is that how it actually happened? Would this be something you would actually eat or something you would actually read? As much as possible, trying to do that kind of visual fact checking, as well as checking the actual like numerical facts and everything of the book. Everything about Guantanamo is really contested. So I had this book fact checked by journalist Andy Worthington, who writes all the time about Guantanamo. He's based in England, and he wrote a book called The Guantanamo Files. So he knows more about Guantanamo than maybe anybody. So then I took that script, and then we also developed a color palette. The artist Casimir Lee developed this color palette, which was the basis for the colors throughout the book. So because each artist had their really own strong visual voice and personal style in the book, I wanted it to be held together and feel kind of cohesive with same colors throughout. So I gave this palette to each of the artists and said, you can use this as the dominant colors in your chapter. You can choose just a few of these if you want, or use them however you see fit, but these are the colors of the book. So this is the artist Hazel Newlevant, who did the first chapter of the book. This is their like storyboard kind of thumbnail sketch to start out. So they take the text that I wrote, that script, and they do a really rough thumbnail, just like looking at what it looks like on the page and seeing how the text fits. From there, they do a much nicer like penciled version. So you can see it's coming together. And then they do a layer of color and then look at the color palette, see how it compares to that, and then did a final layer of color. So this is the final version. And this process from beginning to end took about 6 months. So the artist had, basically, I wrote the book in about 6 months, and then they did the art for about 6 months. It was really like a fast process. We wanted to get it out before the election. And here's another final page from Hazel. This is of me meeting Chris Arendt in 2008 at the IPRC here in Portland. So it was really cool for me to see this real life story come to the page. I want to show you another behind the scenes. This is a chapter it was written by the former prisoner Mansour Ida-Yafi. He is now out of Guantanamo and was sent to live in Serbia, which is not where he knows anybody, doesn't speak the language, but that's where the United States government sent him. And he's working on a memoir about his experiences and was really gracious enough to let me use a chapter from his memoir, adapted it into a comic for the nib, and then into this for the book. This is Mansour's words. It's illustrated by Kane Lynch. As you can see, here's what the script looks like. These particular panels focus on a family of banana rats which are present in the prison. And then here's Kane's sketches for like what we call the splash page, the like introduction page. These are Kane's inks, I think. And then they did some like cool painterly textures. So they actually painted the backgrounds here and did like these textures that they then imported and then put that all together to make this really gorgeous style. Here's the sketches of that page that I showed you the script for. So as you can see, it starts out pretty rough. And then Kane used these like lots of reference images of like, what do banana rats actually look like? What am I drawing here? And use that to kind of develop the style. And I'll just click through. There's the final version of it. So you can see at the end, it has a lot more texture and personality. I love this little scene. Nice pacing. People always ask me what my favorite part of the book is, and I think I do have a favorite moment, so I wanted to share it with you. It's in this chapter. The art is by Maki Naro, and it's about the attorney Thomas Wilner. And Thomas was like not an activist of any kind. He was a lawyer who was representing like business interests and kind of got roped into representing people at Guantanamo and as a defense attorney. And he told the story about being at a dinner party and seeing everyone like laughing and talking around him and just thinking, like he says in the second panel, I would go to cocktail parties and people would sit around drinking and laughing. I'd have this sense, I know this seems crazy, but what were people doing in Nazi Germany as Hitler was coming up? Were they all laughing and drinking as these things were going on? And I just kept thinking that too. You know, this is one of like the real moral crises of our time. And how are we going to respond to it? Here's the next page. Maki, the artist, did such a beautiful job of laying this out and making you really feel the emotional weight of this moment, both for Thomas and for you as the reader, to make you feel like, wow, this is a heavy moment in our history. I'll end here by saying that we were actually able to get a copy of the draft of the book to the men in Guantanamo. They're one of the people who's featured in the book is attorney Shelby Sullivan Bennis, and she represents a man named Abdulatif Nasser, and she sent him a copy of his chapter, and he mailed back this letter. This is a year ago now. It's a little bit hard to read, and it's not all about the comic. So at the very bottom, there's a line about the comic. He says, regarding your comic book, I think it is a clever attempt from the author to draw attention to our suffering in a funny way. So I just was really floored when I saw this letter written in his handwriting from this place that I feel like there's a real chasm I can't go there. The government doesn't want us to communicate. They've in every way possible shut down access to these men's lives and try to dehumanize them in every way possible. And so to be able to like share something with them, to make a book that they can read, and to get a letter back in their own handwriting, that felt like a success to me, to be able to bridge that gap that people in power didn't want us to bridge. So that's my presentation. Here's the book, Guantanamo Voices. The military really enforces that idea of like, just listen to your superiors, do your little job, and don't worry about the big picture questions here. That's somebody else's job. With the guy who I wrote about in the book, whose name is Commander Bashaw, who was like basically in charge of the media tour. So he was like the PR person for the prison at the time that I went there, and was like the person organizing the tour and then answered all the questions, and is the person who's like everything he says is on record the whole time. I honestly don't know how he squares those values for himself. You know, we talked about him being into punk music and like really into like gardening and sustainability. How do you square those values with what you're doing here, with running a prison? And he had a really interesting answer that I recorded in the book, and I'm just going to read it. I said, "Do you feel any moral quandary over the men who have been cleared for release and who are still detained here, and the men who haven't faced charges?" And he said, "I have no opinion on that." And so I said, like, no comment on that? And he said, no opinion. I don't know the stories behind it. There's a lot more to it involved that I don't know about, so it's hard for me to say anything. I couldn't give you an intelligent answer. And to me, that really sounded like, oh, he really didn't want to face this question. He didn't want to face that conflict within his own values. It's pretty hot and dry. And one thing that really struck me about the stories that people who are imprisoned in Guantanamo tell is that they don't get to see the ocean. You know, it's really hot, it's really dry, and they can't actually see the sea that's all around them. They have like a fence that's up that has like green mesh over it, so you can't actually see the ocean. But yeah, Mansour, who's in the book, wrote a really, really beautiful essay that was published in the New York Times, and you can Google to find it, about when a hurricane came through and ripped that mesh covering off the fence. And for a few days, the prisoners were able to actually see the ocean. And they just sat and watched and like marveled at the beauty of the ocean and boats going by. And a few days later, the guards came along and put the mesh up again. But a lot of prisoners like made art for months and years inspired by that one view of the ocean. One thing that I always keep in mind is that keeping someone incarcerated without trial indefinitely is a form of torture. So we can't say that the torture has ended at Guantanamo, because keeping someone in prison indefinitely is a form of torture. And that's why it's banned by the Geneva Conventions and also by our Constitution. So, but the physical abuse that was like widely documented and maybe you can read about in a 6,000 page Senate report or see in the movie that just came out last year with Adam Driver, which is called The Report, or that is really graphically depicted in the movie The Hurt Locker. That kind of like torture program has ended at the prison as far as we know. And that doesn't mean it's not happening at other sites around the world that we don't know about, but as far as I know and as far as the attorneys know, that kind of like physical abuse, such as waterboarding, such as putting people into very small confinement boxes, has ended. But force feeding has not ended. If people go on hunger strike at the prison, it's my understanding that they still are restrained and forcibly fed with a feeding tube, which is really horrible. And it's hard to know when or if people are on hunger strike at the prison. Like I said, the only information that the outside world gets is like through the attorneys of the men. And so that kind of information is really tightly protected. The US government used to release numbers about how many people were on hunger strike at the prison, and then they stopped. So we don't actually know what's going on there. Well, something I hear a lot from my friends and just other people is that they didn't know any of this was going on at Guantanamo, and they actually like don't know anything about Guantanamo. You know, it's to them it's just kind of like a word, or they think, yeah, that's a prison, right? Is it still open? And then feel really like ashamed and embarrassed about not knowing anything about this place. And I always say, like, honestly, it makes sense that you don't know anything about it, because that's been the government's plan. You know, they created a narrative to justify this prison. And then once people very quickly pointed out that it was a horrible mistake, including a lot of people who worked there, who were involved in setting up the prison, as well as journalists and other commentators and activists, the government, instead of changing course or saying, yes, this was a mistake, really doubled down and said, no, this is intentional, and this is something that's in line with our laws. And so because that, and the government really effectively controlled the narrative on the prison for the last 19 years and has sold that idea, and keeping the prison out of sight, out of mind, they've been able to say, here's what it is, and define it for themselves. And so it's actually like hard to understand what's happened there unless you really go digging. And something that I really thought about a lot in writing this book is that actually, like, I didn't have to do that much reporting. Like, I didn't have to find new information, except for doing original interviews. But all of the information about Guantanamo is already out there. Like, there was a Senate report, like I mentioned, that's literally 6,000 pages long, documenting these abuses. There's at least a dozen other books that are really well written and really well reported, documenting these abuses and what happened there. And so it's not new information. I think what's new is sharing it in a way that gets people to understand it, and it gets people to actually read it and feel that reality. You know, it's not about just sharing facts and figures here. It's about sharing that emotional story. The introduction to this book is written by an amazing author named Omar Al-Akkad. And he says in his introduction, I'm just going to quote it here because he says it really well, that the stories in this book are first and foremost an antidote to forgetting. Taken together, they represent not only a wide-ranging account of how Guantanamo Bay camps functioned, but also the impulses, the communal hatred, fear, and cowardice that allowed such a place to exist. And so a lot of times throughout this process, I really question, like, what am I doing? Like, why does this matter? You know, what difference is this even going to make? And reading those words was really encouraging, of thinking of this as an antidote to forgetting, and hopefully a book that can help change our cultural understanding of this place and the people who are impacted by it. And that's what I see my job as being here. One of the most absurd and horrifying things about Guantanamo is that we put a bunch of people in the prison and then didn't really make a policy to let them out. So in order to be released from the prison, if you're cleared of all charges, you're not actually cleared, they just say that you are no longer a threat to America, but never discuss whether you ever were a threat to America. But 5 different branches have to say you are not a threat, and the president has to sign off on your release. But then where do you go? Congress passed a bill during Obama's first administration saying that nobody who has ever been in Guantanamo can ever set foot on American mainland soil. It's not to be put on trial, not to be put in prison here, and not to live here. So what would typically happen is, if someone's accused of a terrorist act, is they would be put on federal trial through our federal system. But because of that bill that Congress passed, the people who are in Guantanamo, even once they're declared to not be a threat, as currently 5 people are at the prison, they can't just be released to the United States under our laws. That could change, hopefully it will. But what the Obama administration started to do after that was passed was to instead negotiate with countries for the release of prisoners to their countries instead. So we won't take them in, but we want other countries to. Under the Trump administration, Trump declared that he would not release anybody. So those transfers have halted since he's been in power. And honestly, I was really, really worried if he had won the election again, it would mean like death in prison for a lot of the guys who are currently there, just because they wouldn't be released probably within their lifetimes. I wanted it to come out before the presidential election to try and influence, hopefully we'd have a new person in power and that we could put this on their agenda and like change the conversations around Guantanamo and really put pressure on both Democrats and Republicans to both close the prison and then to start an accountability process, because no one who was involved in the torture program has been held accountable in any way. Instead, they've been like promoted and rewarded and literally given medals for their work. And so I think 30 years from now, hopefully we're going to look back and say this was horrific, but I don't want to wait 30 years. I'm really hoping to get this book into schools and libraries primarily. So libraries, so people can get wide circulation, and then schools so that teachers can use it to design a curriculum around this book. And I really think about the most clear parallel in American history to Guantanamo is the incarceration of people of Japanese descent during World War II. In that case, it was mostly US citizens who were incarcerated rather than people from around the world. But in that case, their rights of habeas corpus were suspended and an entire group of people was incarcerated based on racism, xenophobia, and we see a lot of the same parallels here. And I think about how when I was growing up, I'm 34, so I grew up in the early 90s, and we learned about that history in school as a shameful part of our past, and something that we should never do again. I remember it was in our history books, and I actually got to go to the site of Manzanar, one of the detention camps, and see that history and really feel like, wow, this was a horrible mistake that we made, and let's do everything we can to not replicate it. And I hope that we talk about Guantanamo the same way in schools. I hope that kids who are growing up now learn about this prison in a similar light rather than seeing it as a necessary part of our system, but instead see it as a horrible injustice that's motivated by racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia.